"I told you to run," he snarled, his back turned to me. His knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, the wood splintering under his fingers. "I told you, I cannot control the hunger tonight." "I know," I whispered. My hands were shaking, but I didn't step back. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy iron key to the study, and slid it across the floor away from the door. Draven froze. The sound of the metal skidding across the floorboards echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Slowly, terrifyingly, he turned around. His eyes weren't human anymore. They were molten gold, burning with a mix of fury and something much, much darker. "What did you do?" he breathed, his voice dropping to a predator's growl that vibrated in my chest. "I locked us in," I said, my voice barely steady. "Everyone else is afraid of the monster, Draven, but I'm not leaving him alone in the dark." He moved then, a blur of shadow and heat. In a heartbeat, he had me pinned against the bookshelves, his heavy forearm bracing above my head, his face inches from mine. "You foolish, beautiful little thing," he groaned, burying his face in the crook of my neck, inhaling sharply. "You think you're saving me? You just trapped yourself in the lion's den. And I am starving." And that, my friends, is why you never lock the door unless you're prepared to deal with what's inside. Welcome back to Storm's Werewolf Romance Library. If you've been looking for a story that mixes high-stakes danger with the kind of loyalty that gives you chills, you have found your new home. Do me a huge favor. If that intro made your heart skip a beat, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube that we want more alpha kings who fall hard for the quiet girls. And make sure you are subscribed. We upload fresh chapters every day, and trust me, you do not want to miss what happens in that room. If you want to support the library even more, check out our channel membership for early access to the uncut versions. Now, I have a question for you guys in the comments. If you were in her shoes, locked in with a losing control alpha, do you hold your ground or do you run for the window? Let me know where you're listening from, and let's get back to the story. Chapter 1. Publicly Broken. The stone floor of the gathering hall was freezing against my knees, but I barely felt the cold. I only felt the burning heat of humiliation rising up my neck, staining my cheeks a deep crimson. It was the winter solstice, the night that was supposed to be a celebration of mates and new beginnings. But for me, it had become a public execution of my heart. I kept my head bowed, staring at the intricate patterns in the grey slate, unable to look up at the hundreds of eyes I knew were watching me. Above me, Jaxon stood with his arms crossed, his shadow stretching long and dark over my trembling form. He was the future alpha of Silver Summit, the man I had believed, foolishly, desperately, was my fated mate just moments ago. "I, Jaxon, future alpha of Silver Summit, reject you, Mina." His voice didn't waver. It boomed, echoing off the high wooden rafters, bouncing around the silent room like a physical blow. A rejection usually happened in private, a whispered tragedy between two souls who simply didn't fit. Mine was a spectacle. "Look at you," he continued, his tone not filled with malice, but with a pity that hurt far worse. "You're too soft, Mina. You can't hunt. You barely shift. I need a Luna who can lead warriors, not a pet who needs protecting." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the crowd, stinging like a whip. I was the girl in the background, the one who tended the winter gardens and whispered to the flowers to make them grow. I was the one who was insufficient. "I accept your rejection," I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of the silence. The bond, that golden, fragile thread that had snapped into existence only moments ago, withered and died in my chest. It left a hollow ache, a cavernous void where hope used to be. I started to stand, my legs shaking violently, intending to run until my lungs burned. I just wanted to find a dark corner and disappear from this life that clearly had no place for me. Thoom! The massive oak doors at the entrance of the hall swung open with such force that the iron hinges groaned in protest. The laughter in the room died instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on my lungs like water. A scent rolled in with the winter draft. Not the usual damp earth or wood smoke of our lands. It was the smell of a brewing storm, of crushed peppermint and rain on hot pavement. It was the scent of lethal power. A man stepped into the light, towering and broad enough to block out the moonlight streaming in from the courtyard. He wore a simple black coat that cost more than my entire life's earnings, but he carried himself with an authority that made Jaxon look like a child playing dress-up. It was Draven, the Dark Alpha King, the ruler of the Nightfall Territory, the lands where the forests were deep and the laws were ancient. Why was he here? He never left his territory. Jaxon puffed out his chest, stepping forward to intercept the intruder. Alpha King Draven, to what do we owe the honor? We were just finishing up some housekeeping. He gestured vaguely at me, as if I were a spilled drink he was waiting to have cleaned up. Draven didn't answer. He didn't even look at Jaxon. His eyes, darker than a moonless night, were locked entirely onto me. He moved then. He didn't walk. He prowled. It was a fluid, predatory grace that ate up the distance between us in seconds. The crowd parted like the sea, terrified to be near him. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was the rejected girl, the weak link. I expected him to kick me out of the way or demand I move. Instead, he stopped inches from me. The air around him crackled with static electricity, making the hair on my arms stand up. He slowly lowered his massive frame until he was kneeling on one knee in the dirt, bringing his face level with mine. "Breathe, little wolf," he murmured. I gasped, realizing I had been holding my breath. I'm sorry," I stammered, looking down at my hands. "I'll move." "You will not move," he commanded, though his voice was a velvet caress that wrapped around my shivering shoulders. "Look at me." I forced my eyes up. I expected to see disgust. I expected to see the same pity Jaxon had shown. But in those dark eyes, I saw a fire. It wasn't anger. It was hunger. Draven reached out, his large hand trembling slightly as he tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His knuckles brushed my jaw, and a jolt of pure lightning zinged down my spine, 10 times stronger than what I had felt with Jaxon. "Did he say you were too soft?" Draven asked, his voice pitching low, meant only for my ears. I nodded, tears finally spilling over and tracking hot paths down my cold cheeks. Draven's thumb brushed the tear away, catching it before it could fall. He turned his head slightly, addressing the room without breaking eye contact with me. "A fool sees a flower and complains it is not a stone," he rumbled, his voice shaking the floorboards. "A wise man builds a garden to protect it." He looked back at me, his gaze dropping to my lips, then back to my eyes. "I have been searching for a mate who brings peace, not war. I have searched for you. Stand with me. Leave this place. Be my queen." He offered his hand, palm up, calloused and large. I looked at Jaxon, who stood with his mouth open, pale and trembling. Then I looked at the hand of the dark Alpha King. I placed my shaking fingers in his palm. His grip closed around me, warm, firm, and unbreakable. As he pulled me to my feet, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. I wasn't just leaving a pack. I was stepping into the unknown with the most dangerous creature in our world. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel weak. I felt chosen. Chapter 2. The Beast's Car. The heavy door of the vehicle clicked shut, sealing us inside a cocoon of leather and silence that felt entirely separate from the world I had just left behind. I sat in the passenger seat, my hands clenched so tightly in my lap that my knuckles turned white, while the dark trees of the forest blurred past the window in a streak of gray and black. The engine didn't roar. It purred, a low, dangerous vibration that hummed through the soles of my feet and up into my chest, matching the rhythm of the man sitting beside me. Draven drove with one hand resting casually on the top of the wheel, his grip relaxed yet controlling, while the other hand rested on the gear shift, mere inches from my knee. The heat radiating from his body was immense, like sitting next to a furnace, and every time he shifted gears, the air in the car seemed to tighten, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. I was shivering, though not entirely from the cold. The shock of the evening was beginning to wear off, replaced by the terrifying reality that I was alone in a car with the most feared alpha in the territories. He didn't ask if I was cold. He simply knew, sensing the tremors in my body before I even registered them myself. Without taking his eyes off the winding mountain road, he reached into the back seat and pulled out a heavy fur-lined coat. He draped it over me with a surprising gentleness, his large hand lingering for a fraction of a second on my shoulder. I pulled the fabric tight around me, burying my nose in the collar, and inhaled. The scent was overwhelming. Not the damp woods of my childhood, but something sharper, like a storm breaking over a mountain range, mixed with dark spices and pure, unadulterated male. It was intoxicating, and for the first time in hours, my heart rate began to slow. "We are almost there," he murmured, his deep voice filling the small space and vibrating in my bones. He slowed the car as we reached a precipice overlooking a valley bathed in silver moonlight, the engine cutting out into silence. He unbuckled his seatbelt and turned his entire massive frame toward me, the leather of his seat creaking under the strain of his muscles. In the dim light of the dashboard, his eyes were pools of midnight, searching my face with an intensity that made me want to hide and be seen all at once. "You are wondering why I took you," he stated. It wasn't a question. "You are wondering why a king would kneel for a girl who was just called broken." "I have nothing to offer you," I whispered, the old insecurities bubbling up like bile. Jaxon was right. I don't have a wolf spirit that likes to fight. I freeze when I'm scared. I'm not fit for a alpha of your status. Draven made a low noise in his throat, a sound of frustration, and reached out to cover my cold hands with his warm ones. His palms were rough, calloused from violence, but his touch was feather-light. He leaned in, his forehead nearly touching mine, forcing me to breathe the same air he exhaled. "Do you think I need a soldier, Mina?" he asked softly, his thumb tracing the frantic pulse at my wrist. "I have an army. I have hundreds of wolves who can tear through steel. I have guards who never sleep. I don't need another warrior." He guided my hand to his chest, pressing it flat against the solid wall of muscle beneath his black shirt. I could feel the steady, heavy thrum of his heart. beating slow and strong like a war drum. My wolf. He is not like the others. He is old, and he is angry, and he has spent the last decade pacing inside my mind, tearing at the walls. I have lived in a state of cold, constant noise. But the moment I smelled you, the moment I walked into that hall, he went quiet. He closed his eyes, leaning into my hand, as if my touch were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. You are not weak, little wolf. You are the only thing in this world strong enough to calm me. That is a power Jaxon was too blind to see, and it is the only power I crave. My breath hitched in my throat. I had spent my life apologizing for my softness, yet here was the most dangerous man alive telling me it was my greatest weapon. I am your anchor, I breathed, testing the word on my tongue. Yes, he growled possessively, opening his eyes to pin me with a burning stare, and I will never let you drift away. He started the car again, the moment of vulnerability passing as quickly as it had come, replaced by his usual stoic command. We drove through a massive iron gate that swung open automatically, revealing a sprawling estate hidden deep in the ancient redwoods. It wasn't a fortress of stone, but a masterpiece of black timber and floor-to-ceiling glass that glowed with warm, golden light. As we pulled up to the entrance, a uniformed guard stepped forward to open my door, his eyes widening slightly as he took in my dishevelled appearance. He stared at me for a second too long, perhaps wondering why the king had brought home a stray in a grey dress. Draven was out of the car in a blur of motion. He didn't speak. He simply slammed the driver's side door and stalked around the hood, placing his body physically between me and the guard. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. A low, feral rumble erupted from Draven's chest, a warning sound so primal it made my knees weak. Eyes on the ground, he snarled at the terrified guard, his voice laced with a lethal promise of violence. She is mine to look at. Only mine. Chapter 3. Sleeping with the King. Draven didn't let my feet touch the cold stone of the entryway. Before I could even protest, he swept me up into his arms, carrying me across the threshold of his home, as if I weighed nothing more than a feather. I instinctively wrapped my arms around his neck, burying my face in the crook of his shoulder, where the scent of storm and spice was strongest. The house was not the cold, sterile fortress I had imagined a king would inhabit. It was warm, smelling of cedar and wood smoke, with a massive stone hearth crackling in the center of the open living space. But Draven didn't stop there. He bypassed the hallways that surely led to guest suites and carried me straight toward a set of double doors at the end of the corridor, his strides long and purposeful. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice vibrating against my chest as he paused with his hand on the handle. "If you need space, I have 20 other rooms, but my wolf, he is agitated. He doesn't want you behind a wall right now." "I don't want a wall either," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper against his skin. The rejection from earlier felt like it had happened a lifetime ago, in a different world. Here, suspended in his arms, the only thing that felt real was the heat of his body and the steady rhythm of his breathing. He kicked the door open, revealing a master suite that was larger than the entire cottage I had grown up in. One wall was entirely glass, looking out into the dark, mist-covered forest, but the room itself was a sanctuary of soft rugs and dark wood. In the center lay a bed that looked like a cloud, piled high with furs and heavy blankets. He set me down gently on the edge of the mattress, but instead of backing away, he knelt before me. He reached for my cold, trembling feet, his large hands engulfing them with a warmth that made me gasp. Jaxon was a fool, he murmured, his thumb rubbing circles into my arch, working out the tension I hadn't realized I was holding. He stood only to retrieve a basin of warm water and a thick, soft towel from the adjoining bathroom, returning to kneel at my feet once more. I watched in stunned silence as the Dark Alpha King, the man who made entire packs tremble, dipped a cloth into the water and began to gently wash the dirt of the gathering hall from my skin. It was an act of service so intimate, so reverent, that it felt more profound than any kiss. He wasn't just cleaning me. He was worshipping the parts of me that others had walked over. "You are not broken, Mina," he said without looking up, his focus entirely on his task. "You were just holding yourself together for the wrong man." When he finished, he dried me with a tenderness that made my chest ache, then stood and stripped off his black coat and shirt, revealing a torso of sculpted muscle, scarred by years of battles I could only imagine. He didn't ask if he could join me. He simply pulled back the covers and waited. I slid into the bed, the sheets cool against my skin, and he followed, his weight dipping the mattress. He didn't touch me immediately. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, his body radiating tension. I shifted, moving closer until my side pressed against his, and I laid my hand on his chest. The effect was instantaneous. A shudder went through him, and the rigid lines of his body collapsed into relaxation. He turned, wrapping a heavy arm around my waist and pulling me flush against him, burying his face in my hair. "Sleep," he commanded, though the word was slurred with exhaustion. "For the first time in years, the noise is gone." I realized then that he wasn't just holding me for his pleasure. He was using me as a shield against his own demons. I was his silence. I lay there, listening to his breathing deepen and slow into a heavy, rhythmic cadence that told me he was finally, truly asleep. I traced the line of a scar on his shoulder, marveling at the paradox of this creature. A beast who could tear the world apart, yet slept like a child because I was near. I felt safe. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the weak one who needed saving. I was the savior who brought peace. I closed my eyes, letting his warmth lull me into the deepest sleep I had ever known. I woke with a start, the cold air hitting my skin like a slap. My hand reached out instinctively across the sheets, seeking the solid warmth of the king. But my fingers met only empty, cooling fabric. I sat up, clutching the duvet to my chest, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The room was dark, the fire having burned down to embers, but the door to the hallway stood wide open, a rectangle of pitch blackness. I swung my legs out of bed, the silence of the house pressing in on me, heavy and wrong. Then I heard it. A sound coming from down the hall, not a human voice, and not a normal animal sound. It was a wet, gurgling snarl, feral and terrified, followed by the sound of wood splintering and something heavy crashing against a wall. It was the sound of a monster that had lost its leash. Chapter 4. The Library and the Rage. I should have run back to the safety of the bedroom, locked the door, and hidden under the furs until morning. But my feet moved of their own accord toward the source of the violence. The hallway was bathed in shadows, the only light spilling from a room at the far end, where the sounds of destruction were escalating. I stepped into the doorway, my breath catching in my throat at the scene before me. A heavy oak table had been smashed in two, splinters scattered across the rug like shrapnel. And standing amidst the wreckage was Draven. He was shirtless, his back to me, the muscles of his shoulders bunching and writhing as he loomed over a cowering guard who looked ready to faint from terror. Draven's voice was a low, thunderous growl that vibrated in the floorboards, reprimanding the man for a lapse in perimeter security, a mistake that could have led intruders near the house. Near me. "Leave," Draven snarled, dismissing the guard with a wave of his hand that looked like it could sever bone. The man scrambled past me, eyes wide, fleeing as if the hounds of hell were snapping at his heels. In the sudden silence, Draven turned, his chest heaving with lingering adrenaline, his eyes glowing a feral, molten gold. He froze when he saw me standing there in the oversized t-shirt I had found, my bare feet sinking into the carpet. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifyingly beautiful. The golden glow in his eyes faded back to deep midnight, and the snarl vanished from his lips, replaced by a look of utter devastation. He took a hesitant step toward me, his hands held up in surrender, palms open to show he held no weapon. "I woke you," he said, his voice rough with regret. "I'm sorry, Mina. The noise. I lost control." I didn't flinch as he approached. Instead, I stepped over the splintered wood to meet him, reaching out to place my hand on his forearm. His skin was burning hot, feverish with the intensity of his anger, but he leaned into my touch immediately, exhaling a long, shaky breath that seemed to deflate the monster inside him. "You were protecting us," I whispered, understanding dawning on me. He wasn't violent for the sake of cruelty. He was violent because the thought of anything harming me drove him to madness. He nodded, covering my hand with his own and pressing a kiss to my knuckles. "Come," he murmured, steering me away from the wreckage. "This is no place for you. I have something else to show you. Something quiet." He led me deeper into the house, down a corridor that smelled of old paper and beeswax, stopping before a set of towering mahogany doors. He pushed them open, revealing a room that stole the breath from my lungs. It was a library, but to call it that felt like an insult. It was a cathedral of stories. 2 stories of books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, accessible by rolling ladders and brass spiral staircases. A massive fireplace, large enough to stand in, roared with a comforting blaze, casting dancing shadows over leather armchairs and velvet reading nooks. It smelled of vanilla, dust, and comfort, a sharp contrast to the metallic scent of his rage moments earlier. "This is yours," Draven said, watching my face closely. "You mentioned once, in the car, that you liked to read. I want you to have a place where the world cannot touch you." I walked into the room, trailing my fingers over the spine of a leather-bound volume, feeling tears prick my eyes. "But what do I have to do for this?" I asked, turning to look at him. In my old pack, I had to work in the kitchens and the gardens to earn my keep. "What are my duties here, Draven?" He crossed the room in 3 strides, gripping my shoulders gently but firmly. "Your duty is to breathe," he said intensely. "Your duty is to be happy. You have spent your life serving people who did not see you. Here, you are the queen. You do not serve. You exist, and that is payment enough for me." He kissed my forehead, lingering there for a moment before pulling back. "I will bring you tea. Stay here. Be warm." When he left, the room felt impossibly large, but safe. I wandered toward his massive ebony desk, which sat near the window overlooking the snowy grounds. It was cluttered with maps and reports, but a small, worn black notebook lay open in the center, as if he had been writing in it recently. I knew I shouldn't pry, but curiosity pulled me closer. I looked down at the open page, recognizing the sharp, angular handwriting immediately. It wasn't a tactical log or a battle plan. It was a journal of pain. Day 4000 without sleep, the entry began. The noise in my head is a physical weight. My bones feel like they are grinding together. The power is too much for one vessel. If I do not find an anchor soon, I will burn this territory to the ground just to stop the screaming in my blood. I am dying. Every day I am dying a little more. I covered my mouth with my hand, a sob catching in my throat. He wasn't just a powerful king ruling with an iron fist. He was a man living in constant, agonizing torture. And I was the only medicine that worked. Chapter 5. The Green Touch. The revelation in the journal burned in my mind, making the walls of the magnificent library feel suddenly too close, too confining. I needed air, and I needed to distance myself from the terrifying reality that the invincible king was silently suffering in a way I could barely comprehend. I wandered through the glass corridors until I found a set of French doors that opened onto the rear grounds, slipping out into the biting chill of the grey afternoon. The estate's garden was a tragic sight, a sprawling labyrinth of dormant hedges and frozen fountains that seemed to mirror the soul of its master. Grand, imposing, but starved of warmth. The plants here were not just sleeping for the winter, they looked brittle, neglected, as if the very earth had been scorched by the excess energy radiating from the house. I pulled Draven's heavy coat tighter around my shoulders, the hem dragging in the snow, and knelt beside a rosebush that looked particularly hopeless, its blackened stems shriveled under a coating of harsh rime. Without thinking, I pulled my hand from the warmth of the pocket and peeled off the glove, pressing my bare palm against the icy thorns. In my old pack, my affinity for plants had been a source of mockery, proof that I was better suited for dirt than for leadership. But out here in the silence, it was the only language I knew. I closed my eyes, reaching for that small, quiet hum in the center of my chest, the green spark that Jaxon had called weak, and pushed it outward. I visualized the sap flowing again, the roots drinking from the deep earth, the cells waking up. A faint warmth tingled in my fingertips, a soft vibration that hummed against the frozen bark. When I opened my eyes, the black frost had receded, replaced by the vibrant, healthy green of a stem ready for spring, and a single defiant bud had begun to swell near my thumb. I have not seen anything bloom in this soil for 10 years. The voice came from above, deep and resonant, startling me so badly I nearly tipped backward into the snow. I scrambled to my feet, looking up to see Draven standing on the stone balcony of the master bedroom, gripping the iron railing with white-knuckled intensity. He didn't look like a king in that moment. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. Before I could formulate an apology for trespassing in his garden, he vaulted over the railing, dropping the 15 feet to the ground with a heavy, graceful thud that cracked the frozen earth beneath his boots. He straightened and walked toward me, his eyes tracking the single green stem I had revived as if it were a holy relic. "I'm sorry," I breathed, hiding my hand behind my back, instinctively ashamed of my strange little trick. "I didn't mean to disturb it. It looked so sad." Draven stopped in front of me, ignoring my apology completely. He reached out, not for me, but for the rosebush, brushing his finger against the new bud I had coaxed into existence. He stared at it for a long moment before turning his burning gaze to me. "You create life," he murmured, his voice laced with a wonder that made my knees weak. "My power is destruction, Mina. It is fire and shadow and crushing weight. I kill everything I touch if I am not careful. But you
You simply touch the ice, and it yields. He took a step closer, invading my personal space until the heat of his body acted as a shield against the winter wind. "Give me your hand," he commanded, though it sounded more like a plea than an order. I hesitated for only a heartbeat before bringing my hand out from behind my back. He didn't take it immediately. He hovered his palm over mine, and I could feel the energy coming off him in waves, a frantic, buzzing static that made the air taste like metal. It was the energy I had read about in his journal, the power that was slowly eating him alive. "I need to ground it," he confessed, his jaw tight with strain. "I need to let it go, or I will shatter. Will you take it?" I nodded, sliding my fingers through his. The contact was electric. A jolt of pure power surged from him into me, but instead of hurting, it felt like liquid sunlight pouring into my veins. I gasped, my back arching, and Draven groaned, a low, guttural sound of pure relief. He slumped forward, resting his forehead against my shoulder, his grip on my hand crushing but desperate. I could feel the tension draining out of him, the agonizing static flowing from his body into mine, where my own nature neutralized it, grounding it harmlessly into the earth beneath our feet. We stood there for minutes, him using me as a lifeline, me holding him as he finally, truly breathed. He pulled back slowly, his eyes clearing, the frantic gold fading to a deep, soulful black. He looked at me with an intensity that scorched me, his gaze dropping to my mouth. He leaned in, his hand coming up to cup my jaw, his thumb brushing my bottom lip. My breath hitched, and I tilted my head back, waiting, wanting. His lips hovered mere millimeters from mine, close enough that I could taste his breath, warm and spiced. But then he froze. His pupils blew wide, swallowing the iris, and he jerked back as if physically pained. "No," he rasped, his voice rough and dangerous. "Not yet. If I start now, Mina, I won't stop, and I will not take you in the snow like a beast." He stepped away, leaving me cold and aching for a fire I hadn't known I needed. Chapter 6. They bowed to him. He bowed to me. The transition from the freezing garden to the grand dining hall was a sensory shock. A shift from biting wind to the scent of roasted rosemary, beeswax, and the crackling warmth of a massive hearth. Draven didn't release me once we entered the house. His hand remained scorching and heavy on the small of my back, guiding me with a possessiveness that left no room for doubt about where I belonged. I was terrified to meet his pack. In my old life, the inner circle of the Alpha was reserved for warriors and strategists, not discarded mates with dirt under their fingernails and wind-blown hair. I expected sneers. I expected the same cold dismissal I had received for years. But as the double doors swung open, I found something entirely different waiting for me. 2 wolves stood by the long ebony table. One was an older man with greying temples and a posture of rigid discipline. Bram, the steward, I assumed. Beside him was a younger woman with bright, intelligent eyes and a nervous energy that seemed to vibrate in the air. Lyra, the pack healer. As Draven walked me into the room, the atmosphere shifted instantly. They didn't look at him with the usual terrified reverence I had seen from the guards. They looked at him with shock. Then their gazes slid to me, and the shock turned to something that looked suspiciously like awe. Bram took a step forward, his eyes darting from Draven's relaxed shoulders to the hand resting comfortably on my waist. He bowed low, deeper than protocol required, but he didn't bow to the king. He bowed to me. "Welcome home, my lady." Bram said, his voice thick with emotion. The estate has been very quiet. It is good to see the fire burning again. I blinked, confused by the reverence in his tone, until Lyra stepped forward, unable to contain herself. His eyes aren't gold, she blurted out, staring at Draven. He's been in a pre-shift state for 6 months, Mina. His eyes haven't been their human colour since the first frost. You turned them off. I looked up at Draven, who simply tightened his grip on my waist, offering no explanation other than a subtle incline of his head. He pulled out a chair, not at the opposite end of the long table, but directly to the right of the Alpha's seat at the head. Dinner was an exercise in intimacy that made my skin flush. Draven ignored the food on his own plate, his attention entirely focused on mine. He cut the meat for me, a primal, archaic gesture of providing that made my wolf preen inside my chest. When I hesitated, overwhelmed by the attention, he speared a piece of tender steak and brought the fork to my lips, his dark eyes challenging me to look away. I opened my mouth, accepting the offering, and the heat in his gaze flared. It was a public claim, a silent declaration to his inner circle that I was his to feed, his to care for, and his to sustain. She eats first, Draven murmured to Bram, who was filling the wine glasses. From now on, she always eats first, and ensure the kitchen knows her preferences. If she wants strawberries in winter, you find them. It is already done, sire, Bram replied with a knowing smile. For the first time, I felt the crushing weight of my past inadequacy lift. I wasn't just a guest here. I was the centre of gravity. We ate in a comfortable silence, the tension of the earlier garden encounter replaced by a simmering domestic warmth. Draven's knee pressed against mine under the table, a constant point of contact that kept me grounded. I was just beginning to believe that this safe harbour was real, that the nightmare of the solstice was truly over, when the heavy oak doors opened again. A guard entered, his face pale, carrying a silver tray. The scent hit me before he even reached the table, a cloying, familiar smell of pine needles and damp river rock. It was the scent of the Silver Summit, the scent of my rejection. The guard approached warily, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor as he extended the tray toward Draven. On it lay a thick, cream-coloured envelope sealed with grey wax, stamped with the crest of the wolf I had left behind. A courier just arrived at the perimeter, Alpha, the guard whispered, his voice trembling. He says it is urgent correspondence from future Alpha Jaxon regarding the theft of a pack member. Draven didn't move. He didn't take the letter. He stared at the grey wax, and the air in the room instantly plummeted to freezing. The relaxed protective mate vanished, replaced in a heartbeat by the terrifying Dark King. Theft, Draven repeated, the words sounding like gravel grinding together. He calls my heart a stolen object. He snatched the letter from the tray, his claws extending just enough to puncture the paper. Read it, he commanded, thrusting it toward me, his eyes burning with a cold, lethal fury. See what the boy who threw you away suddenly decides he wants to keep. Chapter 7. The Scent of a Queen. Draven didn't read the letter aloud. He didn't even open it further. With a look of absolute disgust, he crumpled the heavy cream paper in his fist and tossed it directly into the roaring hearth, watching with dark satisfaction as the flames curled around the wax seal of my former pack. The paper turned to ash in seconds, but the tension in the room did not dissipate with the smoke. Instead, it settled over Draven's shoulders like a heavy mantle of lead. He stood abruptly, the chair screeching against the floor, and turned away from me, his jaw working as he fought to contain a temper that threatened to bring the walls down around us. He muttered something about securing the perimeter and stormed out of the dining hall, leaving me alone in the sudden echoing silence. I knew he was leaving to protect me from his rage, to burn off the lethal energy spiking in his blood. But the distance felt like a physical coldness that seeped into my bones, reminding me of years spent invisible and unwanted. I couldn't stay in the dining hall, and I couldn't go back to the guest wing. My instincts were screaming for comfort, for a barrier against the threat of Jaxon's letter, and my feet carried me instinctively toward the master suite. I slipped into the darkened room, the scent of Draven hitting me like a physical wall. Storm, dark spice, and the clean, cold smell of winter rain. I went straight to the massive walk-in wardrobe, my fingers trailing over the rows of black coats and crisp shirts, until I found a pile of folded knitwear on a shelf. I pulled down a heavy charcoal gray sweater, the wool thick and soft, and pulled it over my head. It swallowed me whole, the hem falling to my mid-thigh and the sleeves hanging inches past my fingertips. But the moment the fabric settled against my skin, I felt my heart rate slow. I was wrapped in him. I was safe. I wandered back to the library, the only other place in this vast estate that felt like mine, and climbed the rolling ladder to the second tier of books, seeking a distraction in the ancient stories. I had been reading for perhaps an hour, perched high above the floor, when the air in the room suddenly changed. It grew heavier, charged with that familiar static electricity that signaled his presence. I looked down to see Draven standing in the doorway, his chest heaving as if he had run for miles. He wasn't looking at my face. His gaze was fixed on the sweater. His sweater, draped over my small frame. The look in his eyes was so intense, so raw and possessive, that I nearly dropped the book in my hands. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, grabbing the railing of the ladder and pulling it smoothly along the track until I was directly in front of him, though still hovering a few feet above the ground. "You are wearing my clothes," he rasped, his voice rougher than gravel. It wasn't an accusation. It was a realization that seemed to short-circuit his rational mind. I nodded, gripping the ladder rungs tightly. "I was cold," I whispered, the lie tasting sweet on my tongue. "And I wanted to smell like you." The admission snapped the last of his restraint. He reached up, his large hands gripping my waist, and lifted me effortlessly off the ladder, sliding me down until my feet touched the floor, trapping me between the wood of the ladder and the hard wall of his body. He didn't kiss me. Instead, he buried his face in the curve of my neck, inhaling deeply, his nose brushing against the sensitive skin right over my mating gland. "You smell like mine," he growled against my throat, the vibration sending shivers racing down my spine. "Now every wolf who walks past you will know. Every breath you take tastes like me." He rubbed his cheek against my neck, scent-marking me with a desperate, primal friction that made my knees buckle. I clung to his shoulders, my fingers digging into the muscles of his back through his shirt, gasping as his lips grazed the pulse point under my jaw. The intimacy was overwhelming, a drugging haze of heat and scent that made the world narrow down to just the two of us. I wasn't just wearing his sweater. I was wearing his claim. He was wrapping me in his shadow, shielding me from the past that was trying to claw its way back in. But as his mouth lingered dangerously close to the spot that would seal our bond forever, a sharp, searing pain suddenly bloomed in the center of my chest. It wasn't the warm flutter of desire. It was a hot, jagged spike of agony that stole my breath. I gasped,
clutching at my heart, and Draven pulled back instantly, his eyes wide with alarm. The mating bond, the biological imperative that we had ignited but not completed, was beginning to turn toxic. The clock had run out on the slow burn. My body was no longer asking for the bond. It was screaming for it, and the delay was beginning to tear me apart from the inside out. "Mina?" Draven asked, panic bleeding into his voice as my legs gave out. "What is it?" I looked up at him, vision blurring, and whispered the only truth that mattered. "It hurts, Draven. It hurts to not be yours." Chapter 8. Nightmares and Lullabies. The pain in my chest had eventually subsided to a dull, throbbing ache, soothed only by the proximity of Draven's heartbeat as we lay in the darkness of the master suite. Exhaustion had claimed us both, pulling us into a restless, heavy sleep. But the peace did not last. I woke, not to the sound of birds or the morning sun, but to the terrifying sensation of the entire room vibrating around me. The air was thick with a crushing pressure, like the atmosphere before a tornado touches down, and the heavy oak furniture rattled against the floorboards. Beside me, Draven was thrashing in the grip of a nightmare so violent that the very foundations of the estate seemed to be trembling in sympathy with his distress. He was making low, guttural sounds of agony, his brow slick with sweat, his hands clawing at the sheets as if he were fighting off an invisible army that only he could see. A sharp, high-pitched crack echoed through the room, cutting through the darkness like a gunshot. I looked toward the wall of windows to see a spiderweb fracture spreading rapidly across the reinforced glass, triggered solely by the uncontrolled waves of power rolling off the man beside me. He was a weapon that had forgotten it was safe. His magic was lashing out in self-defense against the demons in his mind. Instinct screamed at me to run, to flee the room before the glass shattered inward or the energy crushed me. But I didn't move away. I moved closer. I knew that if I left him now, he would wake up alone in the wreckage of his own power, confirmed in his belief that he was a monster. I refused to let that happen. I climbed on top of him, straddling his waist, my smaller frame practically swallowed by the size of him. The moment my skin touched his chest, a shock of static burned against my thighs, but I ignored it, pressing my weight down to ground him. I placed my hands on either side of his face, forcing his head to turn toward me, and leaned down until my lips were brushing his ear. "Draven," I whispered, keeping my voice low and steady, fighting the urge to scream over the rattling of the room. "You are safe. You are home. Come back to me." He didn't hear me. He bucked beneath me, a snarl ripping from his throat, his eyes flying open. But they weren't seeing me. They were unseeing pools of black panic, looking through me to some battlefield from his past. "I have you," I said firmly, shifting my grip to smooth the damp hair back from his forehead. I began to hum, a simple, wordless melody my mother used to sing when the storms rolled in off the mountains. It was a soft, trembling sound in the chaos, but it acted like a beacon. I pressed my chest against his, heart to heart, forcing our rhythms to sync. I poured every ounce of calm, every bit of that weak softness Jaxon had despised, directly into the man beneath me. I visualized cool water, quiet forests, and deep, silent earth. Slowly, agonizingly, the shaking in the room began to subside. The rattling of the furniture stopped. The fracture in the window ceased its spread. Draven's breathing hitched, then stalled, and finally his eyes focused. He blinked, the haze of the nightmare lifting, to reveal a look of profound, shattering confusion. He realized where he was. He realized who was on top of him. He froze, his hands coming up to grip my hips, not to push me away, but to hold on as if I were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. "Mina?" he rasped, his voice broken and unrecognizable. Did I hurt you?" He scanned my face frantically, looking for blood or fear, terrified of what his sleeping mind might have done. When he saw only concern, his defenses crumbled completely. The terrifying king dissolved, leaving only a man who was desperately afraid of himself. "You didn't hurt me," I promised, brushing my thumb over his cheekbone. "You were just lost for a minute. I found you." He let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and pulled me down, crushing me against his chest. He buried his face in my neck, inhaling deeply, his body shaking with the aftershocks of the adrenaline. He held me with a strength that should have been frightening, but I only felt the desperation in it. He wasn't holding me captive. He was holding on to his lifeline. We lay there for a long time in the silence, the only sound the wind howling outside the cracked window, trying to get in. "I thought I could control it," he whispered into my skin, his breath hot and damp. "I thought if I just stayed away from people, if I never slept. But it gets louder every year." He pulled back just enough to look me in the eyes, and the vulnerability in his expression stole the breath from my lungs. "I don't just want you, Mina. This isn't just about a mate bond or desire. I need you to survive. I am standing on a precipice, looking down into madness, and you are the only hand pulling me back." His grip tightened on my waist, possessive and terrified. "If you leave," he said, the truth stark and terrifying in the quiet room, "I will not just be lonely. I will go mad. I will burn the world down because I won't be able to stop the fire without you." Chapter 9. The Unexpected Visitor. The morning had begun with a frantic, clinging desperation that made it almost impossible for Draven to leave the estate. He had been called to the southern border to inspect a disturbance, a mundane task for a king, yet he had kissed me goodbye at the door, as if he were marching off to a war from which he might never return. He had held my face in his hands, his thumbs tracing my cheekbones, making me promise 3 separate times that I would stay within the sight of the house guards. I had promised, meaning every word, but as the hours ticked by and the winter sun began its slow descent behind the tree line, the stifling warmth of the library became suffocating. I needed air. I needed to feel the earth beneath my boots, to remind myself that the peace I had found here wasn't just a fragile dream that would vanish if I blinked. I wrapped myself in his heavy charcoal coat, the one that still smelled intensely of his spice and storm, and slipped out the back doors, intending only to walk the perimeter of the gardens. I wandered further than I intended, drawn by the stark, silent beauty of the ancient forest that bordered the manicured grounds. The trees here were massive, their trunks as wide as houses, creating a natural cathedral that felt holy and untouched. I was humming the lullaby I had used to calm Draven the night before, feeling a sense of belonging I had never experienced in the cramped, muddy territory of the Silver Summit. I was so lost in the tranquility that I didn't hear the footsteps until they were almost on top of me. They weren't the heavy, disciplined treads of Draven's sentries, nor were they the silent prowl of a predator. They were clumsy, hurried, and accompanied by the scent of wet dog and arrogance. I froze, turning toward the iron fence that marked the edge of the property, expecting to see a deer or perhaps a stray hiker. Instead, I found myself staring into the familiar,
pitying faces of my past. 5 wolves stood on the other side of the boundary line, wearing the grey and silver tactical gear of my former pack. Leading them was the beater, a man named Corin who had always looked at me as if I were a broken tool that needed to be discarded. He wasn't looking at me with disgust now, though. He was looking at me with a terrifying, self-righteous determination. "Mina," he breathed, stepping up to the bars, his hands gripping the cold iron. "Thank the moon. We thought he had you locked in a dungeon. We're here to get you out." The sheer audacity of his words struck me dumb for a moment. They weren't here to apologize for the rejection or the humiliation. They were here to play the heroes in a story where they had been the villains. "I am not in a dungeon, Corin," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. I took a step back, pulling Draven's coat tighter around me like armor. "I am here because I chose to be. I am where I belong." Corin let out a scoff of disbelief, shaking his head as if I were a confused child. "You're under his influence," he insisted, his eyes darting nervously toward the house hidden in the distance. "The Dark King twists minds, Mina. Everyone knows that. You aren't safe here. He's the monster who will tear you apart the moment he gets bored. Now come on."
We cut a hole in the fence a few yards down. "We're taking you home." "Home?" I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that startled them. "To what? To the floor of the gathering hall? To a pack that laughed while my mate rejected me? I would rather die in this forest than go back to that place." I turned to walk away, intending to sprint for the house the moment I was out of reach. But I had underestimated their arrogance. Corin didn't just stand there. He lunged. He moved with a speed I hadn't expected, reaching through a gap in the bars where the ground had eroded and grabbing my wrist. His grip was bruising, a violation that made my skin crawl. "I am not asking, Mina," he snapped, his mask of concern slipping to reveal the bully beneath. "Jaxon wants you back, and we aren't leaving without you. You don't know what's good for you, but we do." I screamed, a raw sound of fury and fear, and tried to wrench my arm free, but his grip was iron. "Let me go!" I yelled, clawing at his hand with my free one. "Draven will kill you! He will kill all of you!" Corin just sneered, pulling me harder, trying to drag me toward the breach in the fence. "Let him try," he spat. "We brought silver. We'll put that beast down like the dog he is." The moment the threat left his lips, the world went silent. The wind stopped. The birds ceased their calling. The very air grew heavy and static, charged with a sudden, overwhelming pressure that made my ears pop. Then the ground shook. It wasn't a tremor. It was a rhythmic, thundering impact that vibrated up through the soles of my boots and rattled the teeth in my skull. Corin froze, his eyes going wide as he looked past me, toward the deep shadows of the tree line. A sound erupted from the forest, not a howl, not a bark, but a roar so deep and primal that it felt like the earth itself was screaming. A massive shape burst from the underbrush, a blur of shadow and teeth and fury, moving faster than anything natural had the right to move. It was a wolf, but it was the size of a warhorse, black as the void between stars, with eyes that burned like molten gold. The monster had returned, and he had found someone touching his queen. Chapter 10. The Monster Unleashed. The force of the impact tore Corin's hand from my wrist, sending him flying backward through the air as if he were nothing more than a rag doll tossed by a hurricane. He slammed into the trunk of an ancient oak tree with a sickening crunch that echoed through the forest, crumbling to the ground in a heap of gray tactical gear and pained groans. I stumbled back, pressing my spine against the cold iron of the fence, watching in terrified awe as the massive black wolf stood over the remaining 4 intruders. He was a creature of nightmares, a beast of shadow and muscle that dwarfed the men cowering before him. A low, vibrating growl erupted from his chest, a sound so deep it rattled the fillings in my teeth, and he snapped his jaws. A warning that was clear and absolute. Run, and you might live. Stay, and you will be erased. The patrol didn't hesitate. Abandoning their fallen leader, they scrambled through the underbrush, their arrogance replaced by the primal terror of prey fleeing a predator that was leagues above them on the food chain. Even Corin, clutching his ribs and coughing blood, managed to drag himself into the shadows, disappearing back toward the border of the Silver Summit. In seconds, the clearing was empty, save for me and the king. The silence that rushed back in was deafening, broken only by the ragged, heavy breathing of the wolf. He turned his massive head toward me, his golden eyes burning with a chaotic mix of adrenaline and fear. He didn't approach. He backed away, his ears flattened against his skull, as if he expected me to scream. Then the sound of cracking bones filled the air again, wet and visceral, as the black fur receded and the massive form contorted. It was a violent, painful transformation, one he forced quickly, desperate to speak. In a blink, the wolf was gone, and Draven stood before me in the snow, naked, steam rising from his fever-hot skin into the freezing winter air, his chest heaving like a bellows. He was covered in dirt and smears of blood that I prayed belonged to Corin. But he didn't seem to notice the cold or his own nudity. He only saw me. He looked wild, his hair disordered, his eyes wide and frantic as he scanned my body for injuries.
"Did they hurt you?"
he rasped, his voice a broken ruin of gravel and panic. He took a step toward me, then stopped abruptly, looking down at his own trembling hands, which were stained with crimson. He flinched, hiding his hands behind his back, and took a step away from me.
"Don't look,"
he commanded, turning his face to the side, shame radiating off him in palpable waves.
"Go back to the house, Mina. Go inside. Don't look at the monster."
He was shaking violently now, the adrenaline crash hitting him hard, but it was clear he wasn't shaking from the cold. He was shaking because he thought he had just terrified the only thing he loved. He thought this was the moment I would finally see the violence in him and run, just like everyone else. I didn't run. I moved before my mind could catch up with my heart. I closed the distance between us, shrugging off the heavy charcoal coat I had been wearing, his coat, and holding it open. I stepped right into his space, ignoring the blood, ignoring the danger, and wrapped the warm wool around his shivering, steam-slicked shoulders. He froze, his muscles locking up as if he were waiting for a blow. But I didn't stop there. I reached up, taking his face in my hands, forcing him to look at me. His skin was scorching hot, burning against my cool palms, and his eyes were frantic, searching mine for disgust. "I am not looking at a monster," I said fiercely, my voice steady, despite the tears pricking my eyes. "I am looking at the man who just tore the world apart to keep me safe." I used the sleeve of my dress to gently wipe a smear of blood from his lip. "You are shaking, Draven."
"I thought you would leave,"
he whispered, the admission tearing out of him. He leaned into my touch, his forehead dropping to rest against mine, his heavy body sagging as he surrendered the weight of his fear.
"I thought you would see what I am
and leave. I'm not going anywhere, I promised, wrapping my arms around his waist beneath the open coat, pressing my body flush against his naked chest to share my warmth. Let them call you a beast. Let them be afraid. I know the truth. I know who keeps me warm. Draven let out a sound that was half sob, half growl, and his arms came around me, crushing me to him, burying his face in my neck. He held me as if he were drowning, and I was the only air left in the universe. You didn't run, he marveled against my skin, his voice thick with wonder. I am covered in blood, and you didn't run. Chapter 11. The Summit of Wolves. The grand hall had been scrubbed clean of the solstice dust, transformed into a chamber of judgment that felt more like a courtroom than a meeting place. Draven sat at the head of the heavy ironwood table, a figure of absolute, terrifying stillness, clad in a black shirt that strained against the muscles of his shoulders. He didn't look like a man who had been wild and bloodied in the snow only hours before. He looked like a king, carved from midnight stone. But his hand told a different story. Beneath the table, out of sight of the guards lining the walls, his fingers were wrapped around my thigh, gripping me with a possessive intensity that bordered on painful. It was a constant, grounding reminder that no matter what words were about to be spoken, I was tethered to him. I sat to his immediate right, not in a smaller chair, but in one equal in size to his own, a visual declaration that had made the servants whisper when they brought it in. I smoothed the fabric of the dark velvet dress Draven had insisted I wear, feeling a strange, cold calm settle over my heart. I wasn't afraid. The monster was sitting beside me, and for the first time in my life, the teeth were pointing away from me. The double doors creaked open, and Jaxon entered. He didn't stride in with the arrogant bluster he had worn at the gathering. He walked with the hesitant, jerky movements of a man walking to the gallows. He was flanked by two of his council members, but they hung back, clearly terrified of the aura of dark power radiating from Draven. Jaxon looked diminished. In my memories, he had been a giant, a golden hero who held my future in his hands. Now, standing across the table from the Dark King, he looked small. His hair was dishevelled, his eyes bloodshot, and he carried the sour, cloying scent of nervous sweat that warred with his usual cedar cologne. He refused to look at Draven. His eyes locked onto me immediately, widening as he took in the velvet, the healthy flush of my skin, and the undeniable position of power I held at the table. Mina, he breathed, ignoring protocol, ignoring the king entirely. He took a step forward, his hands twitching at his sides. Thank the moon. I was told you were being held against your will, that the incident at the border was a misunderstanding. He let out a breathless, forced laugh that sounded manic in the quiet room. I came to bring you home. The pack, we miss you. I miss you. The rejection, it was a mistake. A test. I was under so much pressure from the council to find a warrior Luna, but I realized I can't lead without my heart. I listened to his words, waiting for them to hurt. I waited for the old longing, the desperate need for his approval to rise up and choke me. But there was nothing. Just a vast, quiet emptiness where my love for him used to be. I felt the heat of Draven's hand on my leg, the steady, rhythmic thumb rubbing circles into my skin, and I realized with a sudden crystal clarity that I was looking at a stranger. Jaxon didn't want me. He wanted the object he had lost. He wanted to win against Draven. It was never about my heart. It was about his ego. Draven remained silent, his face a mask of indifference, but the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. He was letting me choose. He was giving me the voice Jaxon had always tried to silence. "I am not a test, Jaxon," I said, my voice soft, but carrying effortlessly to the high vaulted ceiling. "And I am not a mistake you can correct with an apology." Jaxon flinched as if I had slapped him. He moved closer to the table, his desperation morphing into frustration. "You don't understand," he pleaded, leaning over the wood, his eyes pleading. "You aren't strong enough for this world, Mina. Look at him. He's a killer. He's a beast. He will break you. I am trying to save you. You belong with me, where it's safe. You were made to be soft, to be kept." "I was never weak," I interrupted him, standing up slowly. Draven stood with me instantly, a dark shadow rising to protect his light. I looked Jaxon dead in the eye, seeing the boy hiding inside the man. "You were just too small to carry me." The insult landed with the force of a physical blow. Jaxon's face twisted, his humiliation snapping the last thread of his control. He lunged across the corner of the table, his hand reaching out to grab my wrist, desperate to touch me, to force the bond to reactivate, to prove he still owned me. "You are mine!" he screamed. He never made contact. Before his fingers could graze my skin, a blur of motion intercepted him. Draven didn't shout. He didn't growl. He simply moved with terrifying speed, his hand shooting out to catch Jaxon's wrist in midair. There was a sickening, wet crunch that echoed like a gunshot, followed by the snap of bone giving way under immense pressure. Jaxon shrieked, falling to his knees as Draven twisted the broken limb, holding him there in a grip of iron. Draven leaned down, his lips brushing Jaxon's ear, his voice a low, lethal whisper that I felt in my own marrow. "Touch her again," the king promised, "and I will tear your arm from the socket." The violence was sudden, brutal, and absolute. But instead of fear, a shockwave of heat exploded in my lower belly. It wasn't just adrenaline. It was a searing, liquid fire that raced through my veins, turning my blood to lava. My knees buckled, my vision swimming as a scent, heavy, musky, and undeniable, flooded the room. The confrontation, the protection, the display of absolute dominance had triggered the one thing we had been holding back. My mating heat had arrived, and it was going to burn us both alive. Chapter 12. The Fever Begins. The scream of my former alpha faded into a dull, distant buzz, drowned out by the roar of blood rushing through my ears. It wasn't a gradual warming, it was an immolation. A sudden, violent fever that turned my bones to liquid and my skin to paper-catching fire. I gasped, clutching the edge of the ironwood table to keep from sliding to the floor, but my legs had already betrayed me. The scent that filled the room was no longer the metallic tang of blood or the sour fear of the council. It was me. A heavy, sweet, intoxicating perfume of honey and night-blooming jasmine that poured off my skin in waves, signaling to every predator in the room that the queen was ready to be claimed. I swayed, vision swimming in a haze of red and gold, and felt the sudden loss of gravity as the floor rushed up to meet me. I never hit the ground. Before my knees could touch the stone, arms of steel were around me, hauling me up against a chest that felt like a furnace. Draven had released Jaxon's shattered wrist instantly, losing all interest in the enemy the moment my scent hit the air. He held me high against his chest, one arm hooked under my knees, the other wrapping protectively around my back, crushing me so close that I couldn't tell where my heartbeat ended
and his began. A low, terrifying vibration started deep in his chest, a continuous, possessive rumble that warned the entire room that death was imminent for anyone who dared to breathe in my direction. "Out," he snarled, not at Jaxon, but at everyone. At the guards, the servants, the very air itself. "Everyone out. If I see a single soul in the hallway, I will paint the walls with them." He didn't wait for them to obey. He turned and marched toward the double doors, kicking them open with a violence that splintered the wood. I buried my face in the crook of his neck, desperate for the scent of storm and spice to ground me. But even his proximity wasn't enough. The hunger was a physical pain, a clawing emptiness in my center that demanded to be filled, to be knotted, to be bound. I whimpered, my fingers digging into the muscles of his shoulders, needing more friction, more pressure. "Draven," I pleaded, my voice unrecognizable, wrecked by the fever. "Please, it hurts." "I know, little wolf," he groaned, his voice rough and strained, as if he were fighting a war within his own mind. He was moving faster now, his long strides eating up the distance to the residential wing. "I have you. We are almost there." He growled at a maid who had frozen in the corridor, the sound so feral she dropped her linens and fled. He didn't care. The mask of the civilized king had shattered completely. He was pure instinct now, a creature driven by the singular biological imperative to secure his mate in the safest place possible before the madness took us both. He carried me past the library, past the guest rooms, straight to the end of the hall where the heavy, soundproofed doors of the master suite waited. He shouldered his way inside, and the moment the threshold was crossed, he kicked the door shut behind us. The sound of the lock clicking into place was the loudest thing I had ever heard. A heavy, mechanical thud that severed us from the rest of the world. We were alone. The room was dark, lit only by the embers in the fireplace. But to my heightened senses, everything was hyper-real. The softness of the rugs, the smell of cedar, the overwhelming presence of the alpha. He carried me to the massive bed, the nest he had built of furs and blankets, and laid me down in the center of it. I reached for him immediately, panic flaring the second his skin left mine. "Don't go!" I cried out, my body arching off the mattress, seeking him. "Don't leave me!" Draven didn't retreat. He stood over me, his hands gripping the footboard of the bed so hard the wood groaned in protest. He was fighting for the last shred of his control, his chest heaving as he stared down at me. His eyes were no longer the deep, soulful black I'd fallen in love with. They were molten, glowing gold, burning with a hunger that had been suppressed for a decade. He climbed onto the bed, prowling over me on his hands and knees, caging me within his massive body without touching me yet. "Run," he whispered, though the word was a lie. "If you want to run, Mina, you have 1 second before I lose my mind." I looked up at him, seeing the beast, the king, and the man who had knelt in the dirt for me. I reached up and tangled my fingers in his hair, pulling his face down to mine. "I'm not running," I breathed. "I'm home." Draven shuddered, a sound of pure surrender, and lowered his weight until he was pressing me into the mattress. "Good," he growled, his lips brushing against mine, hot and trembling. "No more running. Tonight, I claim what the fates gave me." Chapter 13. The Mark. There was no room left for thought, no space for hesitation or fear. Only the overwhelming, consuming reality of Draven's weight pressing me into the mattress, and the frantic rhythm of our hearts beating as one. The fever that had seized me in the dining hall
had now become a raging inferno, blurring the edges of my vision until the only thing I could see was him, the sharp angles of his face, the tendon jumping in his jaw, and those molten gold eyes that devoured me whole. He didn't rush, despite the desperation radiating off him in waves of heat. He stripped the velvet dress from my body with hands that trembled, treating the fabric like it was a barrier to his very survival. When I lay bare before him, I expected to feel exposed, to feel the familiar shame of being too soft, too curved, too much and not enough all at once. But Draven didn't look at me with criticism. He looked at me as if I were a treasure he had spent a lifetime hunting for and had finally, miraculously found. He lowered himself over me, his skin scorching against mine, and began a slow, deliberate worship of every inch of me that had ever been insulted. He kissed the curve of my hip, his stubble grazing my sensitive skin, murmuring praises that undid the knots of insecurity I had carried for years. He told me my softness was his sanctuary, that my gentleness was the only thing strong enough to hold him. Every touch was a claim, every kiss a seal of ownership that went both ways. He was marking me with his scent, rubbing his cheek against my stomach, my breasts, my neck, coating me in the deep, spicy aroma of the storm, until I couldn't remember what the air tasted like without him. I tangled my hands in his dark hair, pulling him closer, my hips seeking his, desperate for the friction, for the pressure that would alleviate the aching emptiness in my core. I needed him to break me and put me back together. I needed the finality of it. "Draven," I gasped, my head falling back against the pillows as his lips grazed the sensitive pulse point of my throat. "Please, I can't take the space between us anymore." He froze, his body rigid as stone, hovering over me. He pushed himself up on his forearms, the muscles of his shoulders bunching with the effort of holding back. His gaze locked onto mine, intense and searching, stripping away every defense I had left. He was the Dark Alpha King, a creature of absolute dominance, yet in this moment, at the very precipice of the irrevocable, he waited. He would not take what was not freely given. He needed to know that this was my choice, that I wasn't just surrendering to the heat, but choosing the monster, the man, and the lifetime that came with him. "Tell me," he rasped, his voice a ruined growl that vibrated in my chest. "Tell me you want this. Tell me you want to be bound to a beast for eternity, Mina. Because once I bite, once I mark you, there is no going back. I will never let you go. I will hunt you across worlds if you try to leave me." It was a threat and a promise, a declaration of possessiveness so profound it should have been terrifying. Instead, it was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I reached up, cupping his face, feeling the dampness of his skin and the tension in his jaw. I looked into the eyes of the man who had knelt for me when the world stood tall, and I knew there was no other future. "I am yours," I whispered, the words ringing with the absolute truth of my soul. "Mark me, Draven. Make me yours. Don't let me go." A shudder ripped through him, destroying the last of his restraint. He collapsed against me, his mouth finding the sensitive curve where my neck met my shoulder, right over the pulsing gland that had been aching for his touch. He didn't hesitate this time. He opened his mouth, his teeth scraping against my skin, a sharp, exquisite warning. And then he bit down. The pain was sharp and sudden, a white-hot flash that pierced through the haze of pleasure, but it was immediately followed by a flood of euphoria
So intense, I screamed his name. It felt like a lock snapping shut, like a bridge being lowered across a chasm. His teeth sank deep, piercing the gland, and his essence poured into me, knitting our souls together with threads of unbreakable gold. I arched off the bed, clinging to him as the world dissolved into pure sensation. But as the physical shock faded, something else came rushing in, a tidal wave that didn't belong to me. The barrier of my own mind shattered, and suddenly I wasn't just feeling my own relief, I was feeling his. I gasped, my eyes flying open as a torrent of foreign emotions flooded my consciousness. I felt a loneliness so deep it was like drowning in a black ocean, followed by a blinding, searing light that was me. I felt his awe, his terrifying adoration, and a protective instinct so fierce it bordered on madness. I felt how he saw me, not as a weak girl, but as the sun that had broken through his eternal winter. I was sobbing, not from pain, but from the sheer crushing weight of being loved this much. He pulled back, his lips bloodied and swollen, his eyes wide as he realized I was crying. "Mina?" He panicked, his voice echoing in my ears and in my mind simultaneously. "Did I hurt you?" I shook my head, pulling him down to kiss him, tasting my own blood on his lips. "No." I projected the thought, feeling him hear it. I never knew love could feel this heavy. Chapter 14. The Morning of the Queen. Waking up that morning felt less like rising from sleep and more like floating to the surface of a warm, golden ocean. For the first time in my life, there was no cold draft seeking out the gaps in the covers, no nagging anxiety about duties left undone or approval unearned. There was only heat, a solid, encompassing wall of heat pressed against my back, heavy and grounding. I shifted slightly, and the massive arm draped over my waist tightened instantly, pulling me flush against a chest that moved with the slow, deep rhythm of contented slumber. But it wasn't just the physical sensation that had changed. It was the hum in my mind, a constant, low-frequency vibration of absolute peace that didn't belong to me. It was him. The bond we had sealed the night before had settled into a permanent tether, a bridge between our souls that allowed me to feel the exact moment he woke up, not because he moved, but because the colour of his thoughts shifted from the grey of dreams to the bright, fierce gold of possessiveness. "You are thinking too loud." A rough, sleep-heavy voice rumbled against the shell of my ear, sending a shiver of delight down my spine. Draven buried his face in the crook of my neck, his nose brushing the tender, swollen skin where he had marked me. I could feel the phantom sensation of his teeth in my mind, a delicious echo of the claim. "I didn't say anything," I whispered, turning in his arms to face him. The morning light filtering through the heavy curtains caught the sharp angles of his face, softening the harsh lines that usually defined the Dark King. He looked younger, lighter, the weight of his cursed power finally balanced by the anchor he had found in me. "You didn't have to speak," he murmured, his thumb tracing my lower lip. "I can feel you, Mina. You feel happy." "I am," I admitted, the truth of it swelling in my chest until I thought I might burst. "I'm happy you're here. I'm happy I'm here." Draven's eyes darkened, that familiar hunger sparking in their depths, but it was tempered now with a deep, abiding devotion. He kissed my forehead, a lingering seal of affection. "Then we aren't leaving," he stated simply. "I am not going to the council today. I am not patrolling the borders. I am staying right here, In this bed, with my queen. I laughed, a light, breathless sound. You can't just stop being king, Draven. The pack needs you. The pack has survived 10 years of my rage, he countered, pulling the duvet up to cocoon us both. They can survive 1 day of my peace. Besides, we have plans to make. He reached out, his hand engulfing mine, and placed a kiss on my palm.
I was thinking about the rose bush, he said softly, his gaze intense. The one you saved. I don't want you just fixing dead things in the cold, Mina. I want to build you something. A greenhouse. No, not a shed. A cathedral of glass, right off the library. Heated floors, waterfalls, trees that bloom in December. I want you to fill this dark house with so much life that winter forgets to touch us. My heart stuttered. He wasn't just offering me a gift. He was offering me a purpose. He was building a physical manifestation of his respect for the very thing I had been rejected for. You would do that for me? I asked, tears prickling my eyes. I would burn the world for you, he corrected, his voice dropping to a serious, fervent growl. Building a glass castle is the least I can do. He leaned in, capturing my lips in a slow, languid kiss that tasted of promises and forever. It was a moment of perfect, crystalline perfection. Safe, loved, and invincible. Then, the world shattered. It wasn't a sound. It was a sensation. A sharp, violent yank in the center of my chest, as if a rusted hook had been embedded in my heart and was suddenly ripped out without mercy. I gasped, tearing my mouth away from Draven's, my hand flying to my sternum as a jagged black pain radiated through my ribs. It wasn't the warm, golden thrum of the new bond. It was a necrotic, rotting ache, a phantom limb screaming as it was severed. I doubled over, a cry of agony tearing from my throat, the taste of ash filling my mouth. Mina! Draven's panic was instantaneous, flooding my mind with a wash of red terror. He was sitting up, gripping my shoulders, his eyes wild as he scanned me for a physical wound. What is it? What's wrong? I couldn't breathe. The pain was pulsing, insistent and hateful, dragging my spirit backward, away from the safety of the nest and toward the cold, muddy border of the silver summit. I looked up at Draven, my vision tunneling, and gasped out the only explanation that made sense. It's him, I choked out, clutching Draven's arm until my nails dug in. The old bond. Jaxon. He's not letting go. He's pulling me. Chapter 15. Severing the Past. The agony that had buckled my knees in the bedroom did not vanish, but it shifted, settling into a dull, persistent throbbing against my ribs, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. It was the phantom echo of a life I had already left behind, a rusted chain dragging in the dirt, refusing to break. Draven didn't ask questions. He didn't rage or threaten to burn down the silver summit, though I could feel the violence simmering just beneath his skin like magma. He understood immediately that this wasn't a battle he could fight with claws or fire. This was a haunting, and I was the only one who could perform the exorcism. The drive to the border was silent, but it was a silence filled with his terrifyingly steady support. He drove with one hand, the other gripping mine so tightly that our pulses seemed to synchronize, his strength flowing into me to keep the pain at bay. When the car crunched to a halt on the gravel access road, the world outside was grey and biting, stripped of colour by the harsh winter wind. We stepped out into the cold, and I immediately wrapped my coat tighter. No, his coat. The charcoal wool smelled of him, a barrier of spice and storm against the stale pine needle scent of the territory line just a few yards away. Jaxon was waiting. He stood on the other side of the invisible boundary, flanked by two uncomfortable-looking guards, his arm encased in a heavy black sling against his chest. He looked like a ghost of the golden boy who had broken my heart on the solstice. His face was gaunt, his eyes rimmed with red, and his posture was slumped, the arrogance beaten out of him by the reality of his loss. Draven walked with me, not in front to shield me, but directly behind, his chest pressing lightly against my back, a solid wall of heat and power. He placed his hands on my waist, his thumbs rubbing soothing circles into my sides through the heavy fabric of the coat. It was a position of intimate support, a silent message to Jaxon that he was merely the foundation. I was the structure. "I am right here," Draven murmured into my hair, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through my spine. "He cannot touch you. He cannot hurt you. Say the words, my queen, and cut the string." I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold air, and stepped up to the line. Jaxon's eyes snapped to me, desperate and wet. He took a step forward, his gaze dropping instantly to the fresh, angry mark on my neck, the bruise where Draven's teeth had claimed me. Jaxon flinched as if physically struck, his face twisting in a mix of nausea and grief. "You did it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You actually let the monster mark you. Do you have any idea what you've done, Mina? You've tied yourself to a creature who doesn't know how to love, only how to possess." "I know exactly what I have done," I replied, my voice steady, surprising even myself. "I have found a place where I am not tolerated, but worshipped. I have found a partner, Jaxon, not a master." The throbbing in my chest spiked, the old bond screaming one last protest, trying to make me doubt. I looked at the man who had defined my worth by my usefulness for so long, and I realized, with a sudden, beautiful clarity, that I felt nothing for him. No anger, no hate, just a quiet, indifferent pity. "I, Mina, fully and irrevocably reject you, Jaxon of Silver Summit," I stated, the words ringing out like a bell in the frosty air. "I sever the past. I sever the pain. You are nothing to me." The reaction was instantaneous. A sound like a snapping whip cracked through the clearing, and the invisible weight in my chest vanished, leaving me light, dizzy, and free. Jaxon stumbled back, gasping, clutching his chest as the connection withered and died, turning to ash in the wind. He fell to his knees in the snow, looking up at me with the eyes of a man who had gambled everything and lost. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the wind rattling the frozen branches. I turned away, leaning back into Draven, feeling his arms wrap around me, pulling me into the sanctuary of his embrace. We began to walk back to the car, leaving the broken Alpha in the dirt. "Mina!" Jaxon's voice called out, shrill and desperate, a final attempt to plant a seed of poison. "You think you're safe? You think this is a fairy tale? Look at him! He is made of darkness! He will destroy you!" I stopped. I didn't tremble. I didn't feel the cold. I turned my head, looking over my shoulder at the man kneeling in the snow. And then I looked up at the fierce, golden-eyed king who was holding me as if I were the most precious thing in the universe. I smiled, a small, sad thing. "No, Jaxon," I whispered, loud enough for the wind to carry it back to him. "He built me." Chapter 16. The Winter Solstice, 1 year later. The music drifted up the grand staircase, a melody of strings and soft laughter that sounded nothing like the funeral dirge of my memories. Exactly 365 days ago, I had been kneeling on a freezing stone floor, shivering in a thin gray dress, listening to the sound of my own heart breaking, while a room full of strangers watched with pity. Tonight, the air smelled of roasting chestnuts, spiced wine, and the thousands of white gardenias Draven had insisted on filling the hall with, simply because I had mentioned once that they were my favorite. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the master suite, smoothing my hands over the emerald velvet of my gown, but my palms didn't flatten against my stomach as they used to. They curved over the heavy, miraculous swell of life growing there, a visible promise of the future we had built from the ashes of my rejection. Strong arms circled me from behind, wrapping around my waist and resting large, protective hands over mine on the baby bump. I leaned back into Draven's chest, feeling the steady, powerful thrum of his heartbeat against my spine. He was dressed for the occasion in a formal suit of charcoal and black, looking every inch the terrifying monarch the world believed him to be, but his reflection in the glass told a different story. His eyes, once endless pools of tortured black, were warm and crinkled at the corners as he watched me. He pressed a kiss to the curve of my neck, right over the mating mark that had long since healed into a silver scar of claim. "You are glowing," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that kicked up a flutter of movement from the pup inside me. "I did not think it was possible for you to be more beautiful than the night I found you. But I stand corrected." "I feel like a whale," I laughed, though the sound was light and free of the insecurities that had once plagued me. "A very well-dressed whale, perhaps, but certainly not graceful." Draven spun me around gently, his expression turning fierce and serious. "You are the vessel of my legacy," he growled softly, his thumb brushing my cheek. "You are the earth that holds the roots of this family. There is nothing in the stars or the sea more graceful than you carrying our child." He kissed me then, deep and slow, stealing the breath from my lungs and replacing it with his own, until the music downstairs seemed to fade into background noise. We descended the stairs together, his hand gripping mine as if he were afraid I might float away if he let go. The moment we appeared on the landing, the chatter in the great hall died instantly. But it wasn't the fearful silence of the past, nor was it the awkward quiet of judgment. It was a silence of absolute reverence. Hundreds of wolves, some from our territory, some visiting dignitaries from packs that had once shunned the Dark Kingdom, turned to look. And then, as one, they bowed. They didn't just dip their heads, they bent low, sinking to their knees in a wave of submission that rolled across the room. They weren't bowing to the Alpha King's fear tactics. They were bowing to the pregnant queen who had turned a house of nightmares into a home of light. Draven led me to the raised dais at the front of the room, but he didn't sit on his throne. He remained standing, pulling me to his side, his arm heavy and warm around my shoulders. He waited for the room to rise, his gaze sweeping over the crowd with a kingly authority that made seasoned warriors look at their boots. "Years ago," Draven began, his voice projecting effortlessly to the back of the cavernous hall without the need for a microphone. "This territory was named Nightfall. It was a warning. It was a promise that here the light comes to die, and only the shadows survive." He paused, looking down at me, and the hardness in his face shattered, replaced by a look of such naked adoration that the crowd seemed to hold its collective breath. "I lived in that shadow for a decade," he continued, his voice rougher now, thick with emotion. I believed that strength meant solitude. I believed that power meant coldness. But then, a girl with no title and no army walked into my darkness and showed me that the strongest thing a wolf can do is heal. He reached out, his hand covering my pregnant stomach in front of everyone, a public declaration of where his true loyalty lay. Nightfall is gone. The long night is over. From this night forward, by the decree of the Alpha King, this pack and all its lands shall be known as the Silver Rose. A gasp went through the room, following by a thunderous roar of approval that shook the chandeliers. He was renaming his ancient dynasty after me, after the flower I had saved, after the softness he cherished. I looked up at him, tears streaming down my face, my heart so full it felt like it might stop beating. He wasn't just my mate. He was a man who had rewritten history just to see me smile. He leaned down, ignoring the cheering crowd, and whispered against my lips. Let them cheer for the pack name. I only care that you know who the rose belongs to. Chapter 17. Epilogue. The Diamond. The snow fell in thick, silent sheets against the arched glass ceiling of the conservatory, burying the world outside in a blanket of suffocating white. But inside, the air was heavy with the scent of blooming jasmine and damp, rich earth. Draven had kept his promise. He had built me a cathedral of glass, a sanctuary where winter was forbidden to enter, filling it with winding stone paths, trickling waterfalls that masked the sound of the wind, and trees that bore fruit even when the ground outside was frozen solid. I sat on a wide, velvet-cushioned bench beneath the canopy of a weeping fig tree, the humidity curling the loose strands of my hair, looking down at the small, warm bundle sleeping soundly in the crook of my arm. Our daughter had arrived with the first frost, a tiny, fierce thing with a tuft of black hair and eyes that were already shifting between my soft brown and her father's molten gold. She let out a soft, contented sigh in her sleep, her tiny fist gripping the fabric of my dress, and my heart swelled with a love so potent it felt like a physical ache. I didn't hear him approach, but I felt him. The air in the greenhouse shifted, the static charge of his presence humming against my skin, before his shadow even fell over us. Draven moved through the foliage like a ghost, his steps silent on the mossy stones. He had discarded his formal jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and marked by faint silver scars. He didn't say a word as he reached us. He simply stopped, staring down at me and the child with an expression of raw, unguarded wonder that he showed to no one else. The Dark Alpha King, the man whose name made grown warriors tremble, slowly lowered his massive frame to the floor. He sat cross-legged on the stone at my feet, resting his back against the bench, and laid his head heavily in my lap, closing his eyes as he exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding all day. "Is she sleeping?" he whispered, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through my legs. I smiled, reaching down to weave my fingers through his dark, thick hair, scratching lightly against his scalp in the way I knew soothed him. "She fought it," I murmured back, keeping my voice hushed. "She has your stubbornness, Draven. She didn't want to close her eyes for fear she might miss something. But the warmth finally won." Draven hummed, a sound of deep satisfaction, and reached up blindly to wrap his large hand around my ankle, anchoring himself to me. "Good," he grumbled softly. "Let her sleep. She will need her strength. She has a kingdom to run one day."
She is a baby, Draven, I corrected gently, tracing the line of his ear. Let her just be a baby. She doesn't need to carry the world yet. He turned his head slightly, pressing a kiss to the fabric of my dress over my thigh, his breath warm against my skin. She will never carry it alone, he promised, the vow solemn and absolute. I carried it alone for too long. She will have a pack that worships her. She will have a father who would tear the stars down if she asked for a nightlight. He opened his eyes then, tilting his head back to look up at me. In the golden light of the greenhouse lamps, his face was free of the shadows that had haunted him when we met. The insomnia, the pain, the constant noise of his power. It was all quiet now, silenced by the bond we shared and the family we had created. I looked from his face to the snow swirling violently against the glass above us. It was hard to believe that outside these walls, life could be so cold. I remembered the girl I used to be, shivering on a stone floor, begging silently for someone, anyone, to see value in me. I remembered Jaxon's sneer. I remembered feeling like a weed growing in a crack of pavement, unwanted and easily trampled. And then I looked at the man resting at my feet, the king who had built a fortress just to keep my favourite flowers alive. You saved me, I whispered, the realisation hitting me as fresh as the day he took my hand. Draven shook his head slowly, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that pinned me in place. No, little wolf, he corrected, reaching up to touch the baby's tiny foot with a reverence reserved for holy relics. I was a dragon guarding a pile of ash. I had power, but I had nothing of value. Then I walked into that hall and saw you. He smiled, a rare, breathtaking expression that made my soul sing. Do you remember what I said to them when they offered me their treaties and their fear? I nodded, tears pricking my eyes as the memory washed over me. I leaned down, pressing my forehead against his, breathing in the scent of storm and peace, and whispered the words that had started it all. They told me I was nothing, I whispered, running my fingers through my king's hair. But in his eyes, I am the only thing that matters. And that, my loves, is the story of how the Dark Alpha King found his diamond. If Draven and Mina's journey warmed your heart tonight, please take a second to hit that like button. It tells the YouTube algorithm that we believe in love stories where the weak girl becomes the strongest queen of all. And if you aren't part of our pack yet, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. The library is always open, and I have so many more stories waiting for you. For tonight's comment, I want to know 2 things. Where in the world are you listening from right now? And what was the one moment in this story that gave you the biggest butterflies? Was it the rejection? The library scene? Or maybe when he finally knelt in the greenhouse? I can't wait to read your answers. Until next time, stay cozy and keep believing in fated mates. This is Storm, signing off.